Right, let's very quickly go through the interface. So in UPBGE, you've got your familiar 3D viewport. We're zooming in and out with the scroll wheel, middle mouse button, pressing down middle mouse button to rotate, holding down Shift and the middle mouse button to pan across the screen. I've got screencast keys switched on, so it is telling us what keys I'm pressing and what mouse buttons I'm pressing. N gives you the properties toolbar, I think this is called. Anyway, so 3D view here. We've got some menu options along the top. We'll not be using very many here. The all-important save. We might be coming and doing a bit of packing of resources and so on, but we won't be using an awful lot of these menu options. We've got a toolbar down here, but we'll be using an awful lot of hotkeys and shortcuts rather than moving back and forward between the toolbar. Over on the right, top right, there is the outliner. This shows you everything that we have in the scene. So within the scene, we've got this collection by default. It has our camera, it has our default cube, and it has got a light. The outliner is just quite handy occasionally, especially if you're naming your objects. You can use the outliner here to switch them off, hide them, switch them off to the render and so on. So we can hide the cube by closing the little eye here, which is also the same as selecting it and hitting H. You can see it closes the eye. H is a good hotkey to be aware of. Alt H to bring that cube back. Anyway, I digress. Bottom right area, there is the properties inspector. So these are all context-specific properties. So while I've got the cube selected, I'll have tabs available to me that relate to that cube. You might occasionally get a bit confused when things disappear. With the lamp selected, you've got a different set of tabs than you would have with the cube, but don't worry about that too much. Down here, you've got me. And then at the bottom, this is the timeline. So this is a bit of an odd decision by the developers of UPBGE, considering they have given us the old Blender game engine inside the current Blender system. They've still given us the timeline as a default window, whereas we need the logic editor. We need an area for us to edit logic, and it doesn't even give us a logic editing workspace. These are all the different workspaces. If you were going to do some sculpting, you could switch to the sculpting workspace and we would have all the options available to us. But we'll just stay in this default layout workspace and we will change the window here. All of the windows in Blender can be changed to whatever windows are available to you. It's sometimes a bit difficult to spot the menu that allows you to do that, but it's usually at the top left of the window. So the top left of the 3D view, we can change it. We can change the 3D view to the shader editor, for example, or we can change the 3D view to our properties inspector. But let's put it back to the 3D view if I can find it. And what we're going to do is change this timeline, which we do not need because we're game developers now, and we're going to change that to the Logic Bricks editor. So I may have explained this to you already, but Blender, although we can use some Python scripting, primarily Blender uses a Logic Bricks system. So this is a visual scripting system which uses combinations of sensors, controllers, and actuators. So I'll give you a very quick example. Sensors are looking for events such as collisions or keyboard presses or a particular movement or the value of a particular property, and then when that event is triggered, something happens. So in this case, on this cube, let's attach. I'm just winging it here, just to give you a quick example of how the system works. Let's attach a mouse sensor. So when the left mouse button is pressed, it'll do something. So what will we get it to do? Let's get it to quit the game. All right, so we choose a game actuator. All right, so we've got a whole selection of sensors. We've got a whole selection of actuators. Okay, so when an event is triggered, all sorts of things can happen relating to the sound, the scene that we're in, and various other things that we'll get into later. So in this case, when the left button is pressed, we are going to not start the game, we will quit the game. And then we just join up this logic brick, this sensor, with this actuator. And it will, by default, it will give us a controller. So the controllers use a logic system to define whether how to treat this event. Let's not worry about this sort of stuff too much, but by default, we'll get an AND controller. If you've ever studied electronics or logic at school, you'll know about NAND controllers and OR gates, NAND gates, AND gates, all that sort of stuff. We'll get into that later. For the time being, we'll just use the default controller. So our mouse event is that the left button is pressed, and what's going to happen when that condition is met is that the game is going to quit. So to test our game, we press P, give it a second, and then press the key, press the mouse, and the game quits. We are not seeing our cursor, so I think it'll be is it in the render properties? We can tick mouse cursor, and if I press P again, now we see our mouse cursor while we're playing our game, and I can click and it quits the game. And notice, although the code or the logic is attached to this cube, I clicked over here. So just while we're on this example, if I combine the left button sensor with a mouse over sensor, so I'm going to plug both of these sensors into our AND controller here. So now it's only going to quit the game when the left button is pressed and the mouse is over this object. This is quite a useful thing to know early doors. So now when I press P, if I click over here, nothing happens, but if I click on the cube, it quits the game. So that's an extremely simplified just view of how these logic bricks work. There's various settings on each of the different logic bricks, sensors, controllers, and actuators, but we'll deal with them as required. Let's first of all have a look at making this cube move about as if this cube was our character. Okay, so rather than using these mouse sensors, what we're going to do is we're going to attach keyboard sensors, and we're going to control our character here with a keyboard press. So we have a keyboard sensor, and we're going to tell it which key we're looking for. So we're going to use W, and then the actuator that we want is a movement actuator. So when we press the W key, we want it to move. It's not movement, it's motion, it's called. And we'll keep it simple motion for the time being. There are different types of motion that you can use. Character motion might be more suitable. We'll stick with simple motion for the time being. And we want the W key to move our character forward, which in this case, we will call, well, actually, while we're thinking about movement, we have to define what's forward and what's backward. So before we get involved in that, let's have a look at this camera. If we hit 0 on the numpad, my screencast keys broken. You can see that this is the view we would be playing the game from, through this camera. So forward would be on the y-axis, yeah, would be on this green axis. So forward would be positive y, backwards would be a negative y value. Okay, so if we say that when W is pressed, we'll go, we will add 0.1 to the Y location of this cube. So whilst the W key is pressed, it's going to move on the Y axis a positive value. So therefore, it'll go forwards, hopefully, when we press P. So press W, and it's moving forwards off camera. Let's just come back out of the camera view for the time being. Now we know what's forward and what's backwards. So that's W dealt with. We can collapse our logic bricks with the little arrows here. So we'll use S now to go backwards. So we'll click this button, press a key, press S, add in our motion actuator, link them up, give us our AND controller by default. And if positive 0.1 was forwards, negative, see the minus 0.1 is going to go backwards. With any luck, we'll just test it again. Press P, W, forward, S, backwards. I'm not getting my screencast keys. Switch it off and start again. There we go. Does it work when I'm playing the game? No. Right, so we've got our back and forwards. So we need our left, which will be A. And while we're at it, let's just add in our right, which will be D. And for clarity, actually, I'm going to name these. So that's W, so that when they're collapsed, I can see that. This is S. So this is where we can name our sensors. This is A. And this is D. I usually forget to name these, but it really is good practice, worthwhile doing. And we should probably name these as well. We could name that forward and this back. Right, so A needs to be joined up to our left hand motion. Right, so if Y is forward and backwards, X is going to be left and right. Left, in this case, will be a negative value on the X axis. So we'll just move, click on the little arrow here. So we've got negative 0.1. Oops. So we're just clicking on the left hand. It's not doing it. Sometimes it's a little bit quirky and we have to add in the controller manually. Yeah, so now it's letting me join it up. Usually you don't have to add that controller in manually, it just does it automatically. So negative 0.1, let's test it again. I think it really is good practice to test every time you make a change. And then let's add our right hand motion. So that's going to be a positive value for the x-axis. Oh, not again. I don't know what causes that. So W moving forward, S moving backwards, A moving left, and D moving right. I think we might set up our camera. Why not? The brief for this game states that we are using isometric perspective. That's a kind of an oxymoron because isometric views have no perspective. So we're going to, with the camera selected, we'll go to our camera properties and we'll switch our perspective camera to an orthographic camera, and we can click and drag on the orthographic scale just to zoom out a bit. What sort of size we want our character on the screen. That'll probably do. So if we press play, we've got W, and our character is just moving about in space here. So we need to sort that out. Let's grab, or let's drop in some ground space. So I have not been moving my 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is still at the center of my scene. And as we know, the objects that we add will spawn in at that 3D cursor. If you have moved your 3D cursor, make sure you do a Shift-C. I think it's every time I play the game, it stops my screencast keys. So Shift-C, and that will add our 3D cursor back to the center. If you'd accidentally moved it over here, Shift-C, and then when we do Shift-A and add in a new piece of ground, a new cube, it'll be added in the center. Right, so I've added a new cube. I've just moved it down a little bit on the Z-axis, and I'm now going to scale it. If I just hit S and scale it, it will scale uniformly. It will scale every value in every direction. But actually, I just want to scale it on the X and the Y axis. I don't want to scale it up and down on the Z axis. So I'm going to press Shift and Z. It doesn't show up in the screencast keys. And then it will scale just on the X and Y. Scale it down a little bit, and then S, Shift and Z. And we'll just make a bit of a ground plane for our character. So if I press, let's have a look at that in the camera. That doesn't look too bad. We've got a bit of an issue here. Oh, see, I've already moved my 3D cursor. That's because I selected the 3D cursor tool. Yeah, a bit of an issue here through the camera. The camera is not picking up this bottom corner of our ground. So select our camera just by clicking on the dotted line into our camera settings. And there must be an issue with the clipping. So I'm just going to drag the clipping. Oh, we've got an issue here. We can't go to a negative clipping value. So I may have to scale all of this down a bit. So just grabbing everything, scaling it down, and let's reduce the orthographic scale Let's zoom back in a little bit. Okay. Right, so that's the issue there with the clipping. Our next issue is going to be that our character is still floating in midair. If we press P, we can move our character about, but he is floating in midair, which is, is pretty cool, but not what we need in this situation. So the reason for this is the physics that we have applied to our character. The physics is in this little tab here with the cube selected. We can go to the physics properties. And by default, our physics type is static. It's a static object. That's good for our ground or for a wall, but not great for a character. So we're going to change our physics type to a character physics type. And what that will do is apply forces to this cube. So when you press P, gravity is applied. So now if I fall off the side of the world, we're gone forever. Falling through infinite space. So that's not a bad start. We've got our character moving around, and we have a little ground plane for him to move around on. Very quickly before we stop this section, let's add one more piece of movement. We'll add a final keyboard sensor. Click to press a key, press the space bar, and we're going to give this character a jump mechanic. So we'll go to motion, and because we have character physics applied to this cube, if we choose character motion, we will have a jump option. Let me see if I can automatically connect these logic bricks. So now, if I press P, spacebar will jump, and our keyboard controls will allow the character to move around. So we'll leave that there for now, and in the next section we'll look at adding some materials and some lighting and some collectible objects, possibly a little bit of sound.